Well, our portion today is, you could see how the Haftarah portion as well as the Apostolic portion are all linked together about the Exodus. In fact, this monumental event, the Exodus from Egypt, forms a paradigm, or shall we say the pattern, for the whole concept of redemption. Now, have any of you had any experiences where you had to redeem something? Come on, you can say, yeah, I did hawk some things at a pawn shop and needed some extra money, and then a coupon? You can redeem a coupon. That's not exactly green stamps. You're dating yourself now. S&H green stamps. How about a Coke bottle? But that doesn't quite fit the picture, does it? Some years ago, I had been introduced by a mutual friend to a gentleman who is, without doubt, a genius. He lives up in Seattle. He's fluent in about 8 different languages. He works as an interpreter at one of the courthouses, especially for those languages that people need an interpreter for. And our mutual friend thought that I would appreciate him because I love languages as well. And so I went to his house after the arrangement. He lived by himself in a fairly large house. There were paths when you walked into the front door. There were stacks and stacks of newspapers and magazines, and they were stacked up about knee-high, but he had made paths so that you could get from one room to the next. And interestingly, he knew where everything was. He knew where the Russian magazines were, where the Dutch magazines were, and so forth and so on. And as we got to talk a bit at the very beginning, he said, I asked him, I said, well, what is your favorite pastime? You work a lot at the courthouse translating. He said, my favorite pastime is to read dictionaries. And he showed me his whole bookshelf of dictionaries of all of the 8 languages that he was fluent in, and showed me that he had read them meticulously, each one. And he could pretty much reproduce how they were different. He decided that I might be a good partner to play what he said was one of his favorite games. I said, okay, what is that? He said, I call it my Bible game. I said, okay. He said, did you bring your Hebrew Bible with you? I said, yes. He said, okay. Let's go into the kitchen where we have chairs, and we'll sit back to back, and we'll each have a watch, and you can open to any portion of the Hebrew Bible, and I'll say, go, and then you start reading, and we see how long it takes me to find out where you are. So I thought, oh, that'll be good. I'll go to one of the genealogies like we had today in our Torah portion, And I don't think it was ever more than 30 seconds that he would begin reading with me as he had turned in his Hebrew Bible to the place I was reading. He was disappointed that I took so long. He would read and read and read, and I was still trying to figure out, if I'd have had my computer with my accordance on it, that would have been different. Well, this friend of mine would sometimes fall on hard times. He was barely getting by financially, and he had a 3-volume set of Hebrew dictionary that I didn't have at the time. And he said, would you be interested in this set? And I said, yes, I would. He said, okay, I'll let you have it for $100 with this caveat, that when I have the opportunity, I will redeem it from you. So I had it on my shelf for nearly a year, and I got a call from my friend, and he said, I would like to come and redeem my dictionary sets, which I said, fine. He gave me back $100, and I gave him back his dictionary. So the dictionary really never belonged to me, did it? It always belonged to him. But he let me use it, and then he redeemed it. Our story of the Exodus is about redemption. Redemption has some very simple realities. And the reason that the Exodus becomes the paradigm for spiritual or eternal redemption. Now, when I say spiritual, I don't mean non-physical. I mean relating to the Spirit of God and His work in redemption. Okay? So, a simple definition of redemption is this: regaining ownership through payment of a price. This basic meaning of the Hebrew word ga'al, the verb ga'al, most often translated by our English word redeem, by extension can also mean to right something that is wrong. In either case, a consistent part of redemption is the paying of the price. You cannot redeem anything without paying the appropriate price. Now, if my friend would have said, well, I'll just give it to you. It's yours. So I took the dictionary, 3-volume dictionary, 4-volume dictionary home, and then when he called me and said I'd like it back, I could rightly say no. Correct? This happened with another friend of mine. He and I played trumpet duets together in college. We traveled all over the eastern seaboard doing that. And he's a much better trumpet player than I am. And some years ago, he called me and said, Tim, are you interested in any new mouthpieces for your horn? I said, yes, actually I am. He said, well, I have a Monet or a Monette that I don't like, and I'd be glad to sell it to you. I paid $220 for it. I'll sell it to you for $100. I said, okay. So I bought it from him. He sent it to me. About 6 months later, he called me up and said, any chance I could buy that back? I said, sorry, I like it too much. You know. So he couldn't redeem it because he didn't retain ownership. So there is a very important aspect of redemption. The one doing the redeeming has prior ownership of that which is being redeemed. This is why redeeming, the word redeeming, ga'al, in the Hebrew, has a slightly different meaning than save. To save means to deliver someone from danger, from disaster. To redeem means to buy back something that you already own. When you combine all of the redemptive words, if we can use them that, or the salvation words in the Tanakh, then you get that sense. But Ga'al is to redeem something that you already own. Yasha is to save someone from slavery, or not necessarily slavery, save one from death, from disaster, from evil situations. But you also have natsal, you have other verbs that talk about delivering. And in the circle of all those, you have all of this idea of bringing you into a place of happiness, of joy, of shalom, and hope, and so forth and so on. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Right. So, if the idea of redemption is that you redeem something, you buy back something that you previously owned, then it's a very clear picture, isn't it? Israel belonged to God before she ever descended to Egypt. As the text states in Exodus 4:22, which we read a few weeks ago, Israel is my son, my firstborn. This being the case, then there's a fundamental question that comes up. Why did God allow Israel to be under the bondage of slavery in the first place? We all do this, I think. Sometimes we do it silently, sometimes we do it openly. When something comes upon us that is so hard and so difficult, we just have a general tendency within the weakness of our own flesh to say, Lord, why? Why did you let this happen? I believe that you are in control of everything, but why did you let this happen? I know that we can feel this way when we lose someone to death who is very, very close to us. We say, Lord, why? Well, we have to ask the same question here. Why did God allow Israel to be under the bondage of slavery in the first place? If he already had ownership of Israel, if indeed Israel was his son, his firstborn, why would he allow Israel to be subjected to such an ordeal? When we read in the book of Shemot, in the book of Exodus, we see the labor wasn't just labor, it was hard labor. It was labor that people were dying under. We had our sons being taken from us and slaughtered. This is the basic question in the minds of the sages who wrote the Midrashim as well. When you start out, if you know the Midrash, they're kind of like, well, they're like devotions. They're like kind of little sermonettes on the text. And of course, the rabbis like to stretch the text a little bit here and there to make it interesting. But they ask the same question. They answer by quoting from the wisdom literature of the Tanakh. Whom the Father loves, he chastens. And here's a quote from the Midrash. Midrash Rabbah, Exodus 1:1. But he that loveth him chasteneth him diligently. Proverbs 13:24. This refers to the Holy One, blessed be he, because of his love for Israel, as it is written, I have loved you, says the Lord, in Malachi 1:2. Doth he heap upon them chastisements. You will find that the three precious gifts which God gave unto Israel were all given after much suffering. The Torah, right? That was right after we got out of Egypt, after all the suffering in Egypt. Eretz Israel, what did we have to do to get into Eretz Israel, the land of Israel? We had to fight. We had to lose soldiers. And also because we didn't go in when he told us to, we had to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And the life to come. Well, I don't agree with the sages on many things, but I will have to say this. They have wisdom because they spent so much time in the text of the Bible. Are we on a road that is absolutely guaranteed us to be easy and joyful and wonderful all the time? Yeshua said, what did he say? In this world you will have tribulation. But have a happy face, right? Be of good cheer, the King James Version said. Don't let the tribulations take your spirit away from the hope. Why? Because be happy or be joyful because I have overcome the world. We joke sometimes about first world problems. You know, like road rage. The guy ahead of you has a drivetrain fall out, and you're in a hurry, and it just upsets you to no end. We don't think about the fact that there are people in other parts of the world that don't have cars, and if they did have cars, there's no roads to drive on, and what roads there are aren't worth driving on. And wow, you know that old adage, I felt sorry for myself when I couldn't get a new pair of shoes until I saw the man that didn't have any feet. Sometimes we make our first world problems into something that they should never be, and we complain and so forth and so on. But can we have tribulation in this world, in this first world? Yes, we can. And we shouldn't minimize those tribulations. Sometimes those tribulations are more inward because we don't know how to express the pain and the sorrow that we're feeling. Sometimes those tribulations are because we're being ill-treated in whatever way from people that should be looking after us. Well, how do we deal with tribulation? I can't tell you how many times I've talked with people in the last 50 years who immediately their first thought is, I must have done something wrong. God must be punishing for my sin. God must be, disciplining me for my sin, but I can't figure out what I did wrong. Well, it is a good thought to say, Lord, is there something in my life you're trying to get my attention? Sometimes he calls us and we're busy doing our stuff over here and busy doing our thing, and we don't want to listen to him. And he gets our attention, doesn't he? I've known people I've visited at the hospital who said he got my attention. He couldn't get my attention until he laid me flat on my back in this hospital bed. And now I have nothing to do but either look at the ceiling or ask myself, what's going on in my life? God can get our attention. But tribulations don't mean that God is punishing us or disciplining us. Sometimes it's because we live in a fallen world. And sometimes it's because He wants us to appreciate His love more than we have. The chastening hand of the Lord upon Israel was needed, for she had a natural tendency to believe in self-redemption. And indeed, this is kind of the plight of all fallen mankind. That we're self-sufficient, that we can pull ourselves up by the bootstraps. I don't know, is this more of a tendency among men than women? No. I see some women shaking head. No. Okay. All right. I don't know, in this, I call it the John Wayne syndrome. You young kids don't know who John Wayne is, but those of us that are a little bit older, he was an actor that always played the rough, tough, I can do it myself kind of a guy. Yeah, a man's got to do what a man's got to do. You never saw him cry. That wouldn't be manly. You never saw him ask for help. That wouldn't be manly. And some of us grew up in that kind of an era where you kind of got this feeling that if I ask somebody to help me, that means I'm a wimp. You know, I want to be like John Wayne, a man's man. Well, we think of that when we're walking our life of faith and we say, I don't need any help. Yes, we all need help. That's why community is essential. Indeed, it is when we are faced with trouble and calamity that we once again admit that we are unable and weak, and that's when we cry out to God. It's when we come and we have no resources left. Something has happened during our months, and we've had emergency after emergency, and we've spent our bank account, and we're wondering, Lord, how? And then all of a sudden, what do? We get on our knees and we start saying, Lord, would you please meet my needs? When everything was fine, when my paycheck was being stretched just fine over the month, I never asked Him for anything. I never thanked Him because my employer was giving me my paycheck. And all of a sudden, I realized, no, it wasn't my employer. It was God through my employer. God is the source of all that I have, and it's by His grace. So the fact that God brings us under the rod of chastening by putting us into a difficult or troublesome situation does not negate the fact that we belong to Him, nor does it call into question His love for us. Indeed, the very place of trouble is where He intends to demonstrate His outstretched arm of redemption, not only to assure us of His unfailing faithfulness to His promises, but also to prove to us once again that apart from Him, we can do nothing. There is one clear characteristic of the redeemed soul, of the one who has true saving faith, a willingness first to admit my inability, and secondly, to entrust myself into God's care. You say, well, wait a minute, Tim, what kind of self-image are you trying to have us? You know, like we have a terrible self-image. No, we're created in the image of God. But we live and we move and have our being in Him. We get up in the morning because He has sustained our life. We go to sleep at night and we get rest because He gives us rest. This is why it says in Deuteronomy, right? When you have eaten and are satisfied, what are you supposed to do? Thank the Lord for the food. Why? Lest you become proud in your own self and say, it is by my strength that I have this food. Well, it is by our strength. We plant, we harvest, and so forth and so on. Or we stock the shelves, or we go to the Safeway and buy it, or whatever. We have to extend ourselves. But if it weren't for God's grace, we wouldn't be able to do that. Self-reliance is diametrically opposed to biblical faith. Now, God often has to bring us into situations of dire straits before we are willing to admit that we cannot make it on our own. Our hearts, that is, our minds, our wills, are still affected by the natural thinking, by the depraved self or flesh, which in the strength of the remaining tendencies to rebellion tends to believe that one can get along fine without God. Yet it is the indwelling Ruach, the Spirit, who enlivens the redeemed soul to face the truth and willingly admit it, without God I can do nothing. If the difficulties of life are that which brings us to this place of truth and confession, then certainly we have come to understand why we would give thanks to God for such trials and tribulations. They bring us to appreciate the redemption God has made for us. And so James writes, as we all know, consider it all kinds of joy. Is this guy a masochist? When you encounter various trials, knowing that the testing of your faith produces endurance, and let endurance have its perfect result, so that you may be perfect and complete, lacking in nothing. Every gold medalist at the recent Olympics gave hours and hours and days and weeks and months and years of toil, and sometimes very difficult toil, in order to gain the prize. Endurance. What's the sure mark of salvation? Is it how I feel? Is it the plaque that I have on the wall that says I accepted Yeshua as my Savior on such and such a day? I can look at that and say, that's proof. Well, all of those may be good and important, but the real proof of salvation is perseverance. How do we know it? Because of that unbreakable chain in Romans 8. And all those he foreknew, he also predestined to become conformed to the image of his Son. And those whom he predestined, these he also called. And those whom he called, these he also justified. And those whom he justified, these he also will glorify, right? Wrong. It's past tense. All those that he justified, he also glorifies. Wait a minute. I'm not glorified yet. I've got plenty of ways to go before that happens. Yes. But just as sure as he called you, and just as sure as he justified you, just that sure he will glorify you. He can talk about it as though it's already done, because in his purposes it is. He will lose none. So we can consider it all joy when we come into those difficult times. But once the soul that belongs to God has reckoned with its innate inability, faith working within causes that soul to rest in the all-sovereign one and his promised care. The two parts go hand in hand, admitting my ability, relying upon God. And when I rely upon God, what does he give me the strength to do? What I'm supposed to do. Right? I become active in obedience. Why? Because I'm better than the next guy? No, because God is at work in me, both to will and to do of his good pleasure. Well, this isn't the case with the unbeliever. The unbelieving heart may be forced to admit its inability, but there will still be an unwillingness to lay oneself upon God and trust him for his care. Rather, the unbelieving heart hardens in rebellion against God for reasons that God has arbitrarily brought the calamity, and this for selfish reasons, or doesn't believe that God is there at all. Like the sin entered into by Adam and Chava, the heart of unbelief questions the very goodness and love of God. The lie of the evil one, has God said, was received by Adam and Chava as a valid questioning of God's goodness, right? He's not asking them to repeat exactly what God has said. He's questioning whether or not what God had said is right, is good. Had God given the prohibition regarding the tree of knowledge of good and evil for selfish reasons? Is God selfish? No, he's not selfish if selfish is a sin. But all things are of him, and through him, and to him. Well, he's jealous because he owns us. He doesn't want some other demonic god alluring us away from his worship. There's good jealousy, you know that? Yeah. A husband and a wife should be jealous for each other. That is recognizing that there is a unique relationship between a husband and a wife that is to be entered into by no one else. 2 is a company, but 3 is disaster. Acquaintance of mine, he was a partner with another man. They owned a business together out on the East Coast. He's an atheist, and we were on vacation out there, and he was there, and we were talking. And he finally opened up. He said, "You know what you know the trouble I have with you people who believe in God?" I said, "What's that?" He says, "Because he's an egotist. He wants everything. He wants all the glory. He wants everything. I said, "No, he's not an egotist. He's God. Everything belongs to him. He created everything. He has the right to receive the glory that's due unto him. You don't give your wages to your employees out of the goodness of your heart. You give wages to the employees because they earned it. They gave you time, energy, and expertise, and you bought it from them, and so you pay them." I said, "We're not doing God a favor when we give him all of the glory. We're only giving to him what he already deserves." He couldn't accept it. Maybe someday he will. The core element of the unbelieving heart, then, is a self-centered reliance based upon the suspicion that if God is there, he is not good, or he is not always good. This being the case, how one interprets the struggles and troubles of life will depend ultimately upon whether one has faith or not. The heart of faith eventually confesses that even the tribulations in life are a mark of God's love. The unbelieving heart thinks just the opposite. It takes maturity to accept tribulation as from God's hand as a mark of love, doesn't it? It takes increased faith. It takes faith that will not be persuaded otherwise. Well, all of this does not mean that one who has genuine faith fails to express the woes and despairs of tribulations. I know people who have heard a message like this or even given a message like this, and they walk around with this pasted smile on all the time. Like, I'm hurting inside, but I just want everybody to know how happy I am. It hurts so much. It's so good. That's not what the Scriptures teach either. It says, "Sorrow with those, weep with those who weep, mourn with those who mourn, rejoice with those who rejoice." There is a time for mourning. There is a time for crying. There is a time for our broken heart to be expressed. Yeshua himself, before the cross, expressed an angst that was too deep for us to understand or to express ourselves. The psalmist demonstrates this often, that at first, when trouble comes upon him, he cried out in pain and frustration about why God would allow such a thing, right? I mean, read Psalm 72 or read many of the other Psalms. He says, I look out and the wicked, they're just prospering like crazy. They got more money than they know what to do with. I'm paraphrasing. They got flocks. They don't ever have any trouble. They party at night. They just have a great time. Everything's good. He said, "So why am I so diligent about being righteous before you, God? I could just go live this life of live it up and just do whatever and have a happy time of it." And how does the psalm go at the end of 72? "Until I entered into the house of the Lord, then I understood their end." They're in slippery places. Destruction is going to come upon them all at once in a sudden time of destruction, and they'll have no way out. So, this inevitably happens. After contemplating what he knew to be true, the psalmist's heart of faith was able to accept the tribulations of life and even to be strengthened and encouraged through them. He would oftentimes, after he kind of unloads his heart to the Lord, say, "But you are my strength. You are my hope. You are the one in whom I believe. You will give me victory, however it may come." This picture of redemption of the soul is graphically laid out before us in the Exodus story. Israel, the possession of God, is brought by his hand into slavery and bondage. This trial brought Israel to realize that she was powerless to overcome the hardship in which she found herself, and thus she cried out to God. Would she have called out to him had the trouble not arisen? Or would she have willingly remained in the pagan culture of her rulers, foregoing the full outward worship of Hashem? All indications are that she would have remained content to abide in pagan Egypt. Why do we think that? As soon as she comes out of Egypt and she's in the desert, she's saying, come on, let's go back. These manna burgers are just, ugh, right? Let's go back where we have leeks and we have, garlic and we have all this wonderful food. Had they forgotten that their sons were being put to death, that their husbands were dying in the fields and so forth? But the love of Hashem for his people would not allow such spiritual apathy. His love for her is demonstrated in his willingness to bring Israel under the rod of his chastening, that she might cry out to him and experience the power of his redemption. The picture given to us in the Exodus is not only of God's redemptive hand, but also of the depraved heart of unbelief. Pharaoh, in contrast to Moshe and Aaron and the people of Israel, displays the characteristics of the natural heart given to unbelief. In our Parashah, we have the first three signs and wonders that God sent. First of all, the Nile and the water in Egypt turns to blood. Now, do we really think it turned to blood, or was it just a red algae? I agree. If it says blood, it means blood, which is interesting because it's just a red moon, or is it really a moon covered with blood? That's a good question. Yeah, we could talk about that later. But there's red algae that blooms every year in the Nile. It's a common thing. It just doesn't bloom at the time of the Exodus. They couldn't even drink from it. And, it blooms and then it goes away and whatever. So I've read. But the point simply is that this doesn't only show up in the river of the Nile, it shows up in their buckets in their house. Right? Their wooden buckets. And the second one is an infestation of frogs, and then there was an infestation of insects. This sounds like insanitary conditions, or insanitary if you're not a Brit. Previously, the transformation of Moses' rod into a snake and its return to the form of a stick had apparently been received by the people of Israel as a mark of authenticity of Moses' authority and power from God. The same sign, however, in the presence of Pharaoh and his court, only produced further hardening of their hearts. What does this tell you? It tells us that the evil one can do signs. Just because you see something that can't be explained, just because somebody has an experience that can't be explained, doesn't mean it's necessarily from God. The very same thing that Moses did was duplicated by the necromancers and so forth in Egypt. So the one sign is used to bring authenticity for Moses. The other sign just hardens Pharaoh's heart. Now, some would say God was the one who produced that sign. That may well be the case. He said he was going to harden his heart. Well, the same may be true of signs and wonders that Moses and Aaron displayed. The Nile turning to blood was a devastating plague, for it had hit at the very center of the Egyptian social and religious foundation. Like a woman with a flow of blood is unclean for 7 days, so the Nile in our text became unclean, unfit to drink, and thus the life flow of Egypt was defiled. Remember, the Nile was considered to be one of the prime gods of Egypt. It was the life-giving god that brought all of the water they used for irrigation for their fields and so forth. And now the god was bleeding. Rather than a life-giving source, it was turned into the stench of death. But even though every Egyptian had nothing but blood in water buckets and bowls, the Israelites apparently were unaffected by the plague and had fresh water to drink. Only newly dug wells or even troughs beside the Nile afforded drinking water for the Egyptians. But there was no humility in Pharaoh and his court. They considered the whole thing to be some sort of magic that Moses and Aaron had performed. Does that sound familiar? Who else was charged of doing miracles by way of magic? Yeshua, right? You do these things by the power of Beelzebul. Black magic. There was no humility. They considered the whole thing to be some sort of magic that Moses and Aaron had performed. They duplicated the phenomena through their magical arts, but like the last plague, the first one had the portents of death. The second wonder was frogs everywhere. And the third was like it, flying insects. The frog living in the Nile was viewed by the Egyptians as connected to the divine power of the river. They were, as it were, the god's offspring. As such, they too were sacred. But instead of affording the Egyptians life and health, they brought disease and trouble. The text says that they would come into you and your people and in all your servants. Now, I'm being very literal there because the Hebrew preposition bet can mean in. It can also mean upon. Do you think that they ingested some of the frogs? It was in their food. It was in their kneading bowls. Maybe it actually was in them. So it could be understood as upon. The preposition could surely be taken either way. It stands to reason that such an infestation of frogs must surely have led to disease, for the people must have ingested parts of the frogs. Yet in the rebellion, the magicians of Egypt add to the calamity by adding to the frogs. The magicians come and say, don't worry, we can do this too. And what do? More frogs. Really? The way you help this thing is just to make more of them? So they only can make the situation worse. Even Moses, who carefully constructs the divine removal of the frogs so as to leave no question by whose power it was done, when he removes the frogs through the prayer to Hashem, the piles of dead frogs cause a great stench throughout the land. Such unsanitary conditions are just what insects enjoy. The dead frogs were the perfect carrion to support maggots, producing the flying insects that overtook the land as Pharaoh refused to believe and broke his pledge to send the people of Israel forth from his land. By the way, you noticed, those of you obviously that were reading your Hebrew, but you may know this at any rate, it doesn't say, let my people go. It's an imperative that says, send forth my people. It's not really just giving them permission. It's saying, you, out of here. That's what Pharaoh was supposed to do. Now in this third wonder, the magicians and Pharaoh are confronted with the obvious. This wonder could not be duplicated by the works of magic. It was indeed the miraculous work of Hashem. If we could excuse Pharaoh for his unbelief of the first two wonders, there is no excuse for denying this third one. He and his court knew beyond doubt that what was taking place was the direct action of the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. Yet he willfully turns his back and walks in blatant unbelief. I just have to say here, just add this comment. It's amazing to me the number of people that I've met who are professors or teachers in upper education and even in postgraduate education who claim to be evangelicals and who have turned away from a biblical creation model to a creation model that simply is against science and against everything, but it comports with the standard secular view of evolution. How can you look at the molecular structure of the cell or of the DNA or how the human body works and say, well, it just happened? How is it possible that they could see the very hand of God and not admit it? So all I'm saying is that, there are people who claim to say, I believe in God, okay? But when confronted with the facts of God, they have an unwillingness, they have some kind of hardness of heart to admit what seems to be irreconcilable with their rational abilities to explain. I don't know any other answer than that. All right, so here we have in stark contrast the distinct characteristics of faith versus unbelief. And as such, we are given a litmus test of our own faith. True faith in God admits one's utter inability and thus turns to rely entirely upon God for one's eternal salvation, a salvation that not only has the Olam Haba, the world to come, in view, but also the life of salvation in the Olam Hazeh, in this world. Unbelief tries to find one's own way and to secure one's own redemption. The life of faith is just the opposite. It is one of humility, while unbelief is marked by self-reliance. Faith says, there dwells in me, that is in my flesh, not one good thing, while unbelief proudly affirms, who is Adonai that I should obey his voice? Only faith saves. Everything else will perish. We'll take the rest of this after lunch as part of our study in the afternoon, and then I want to do a quick overview as what Michael did here with the children, but I want to make it a little more adultish in the sense that you did very well with that young group. I'm going to suggest, I won't be dogmatic about it, but I think it could well be the case that the way that the festivals have been given to us outline betrothal and marriage. And so it seems to me that the way the festivals work, it fits that very well. I'd like to show that to you. But just before we finish, this note on Exodus 6:3, where it says, God spoke further to Moses and said to him, I am Adonai, and I appeared to Abraham, Isaac, and Yaakov as El Shaddai, but by my name, Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, I did not make myself known to them. People are saying, wait a minute. It's used all the way through the book of Genesis. Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, they all were confronted with Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh. What does it mean? They didn't know. Well, I hope your eyes were being perked up as we read through both our Torah portion as well as the Haftarah portion. And how many times in Ezekiel did we read, and then they will know that I am Yod-Heh-Vav-Heh, right? So we're going to look a bit at that, and then we'll go on and survey the 5 Torah festivals and try to get an overview of them as we begin to come toward the celebration of the festivals.